Science of Drug Use for Grown-Ups. And actually the correct title, but it just didn't fit in, was For Responsible Grown-Ups, I believe. Is that correct?
No, that's in the book. I define what a grown-up is, and it's basically someone who's responsible. Yes, that's right.
Okay, got it. So before we get started, I would just like to ask for anyone that's participating in the audience, I'm going to let you know how the room is going to run. What I want you to do is there is a little plus sign down the bottom. If you think you know someone, and there's two types of people that might enjoy this room. There are people who have their own drug experiences and their own attitude towards taking drugs. And then there are people, obviously, who have decided that drugs are bad, and drugs definitely aren't for them, and they have their own internal narrative about whether drugs are good or bad, and it's a very binary point of view. If you know someone in your life that has that point of view, this might be a really eye-opening and interesting conversation, and that is the important word here. It's a conversation with an expert, with a scientist who has the data and some stats and, of course, some opinions, because we all do. And we're going to open up the floor and do a Q&A. And Carl has given me his trust to responsibly moderate this Q&A. So hopefully we can make this work and be a super enlightening conversation. So you ready, Carl?
Yes, I am.
Awesome. Okay, so for those that don't know you, can you just start off with a little bit of background, like who you are, why you do what you do?
Okay, yeah, I'm Carl Hart. I'm a professor at Columbia University. I'm also a research scientist at the New York State Psychiatric Institute. I'm an author of books, scientist. My research looks at the effects of drugs in people. When I say drugs, I mean drugs like cocaine, methamphetamine, marijuana, oxycodone, all of the drugs that people kind of take for to alter their psychological functioning, the drugs that people take for fun. And so I hope that helps people to understand who I am.
That was great. You missed out fucking legend, but I guess, you know, you wouldn't be saying that about yourselves. That's me. I'll do those superlatives for you. Okay.
Well, thank you.
So, you've recently brought out a book, and I think this is interesting to point out. So the title of the book, the concept of the book, you know, it definitely causes some controversy, right? So the first place I want to start just in this conversation is how it affects you personally, emotionally, to come out and declare openly amongst your scientific circles, your peers, and and your family as well, and then of course the media, to say, I am a drug taker, and I'm open and comfortable doing that, saying that. How does that affect you mentally? Before we get into obviously the details of everything behind it.
Yeah, so I have to explain even why I would be so revealing in public. So one of the reasons that I wrote this book was to try to help people to understand how we could better serve those people who were catching hell simply because they were being identified as a drug user. That is, people who we vilify because they report using crack or heroin or some other drug. And we vilified him simply for that reason. And so I wrote this book to kind of show people how we can better serve other people who identify as drug users, how we can help people, how we can do this activity more safely. And in the process, I asked the reader to do something for me. I asked the reader to come out of the closet about their own drug use, because I know, traveling around the world with this book, it took me on 5 different continents, many countries in between. I know from traveling around the world that the typical drug user is a middle-class, upstanding person who is working, who's responsible. But that's not the image that the public has of the typical drug user. So I was asking people to come out of the closet about their own drug use, so we could shift this narrative, so we can stand up on behalf of the people who are being persecuted. Now, if I was going to ask people to get out of the closet about their own drug use, then I had to at least do the same. And so that's why I acknowledged my own drug use. But it's not done in some way where you can be some voyeuristic pedantic, judgmental person. It's done in a way just to show solidarity. It's done in a way that demonstrates how to do civil disobedience. But sometimes people only look at my disclosure. There is so much good information in this book. So much information that will keep people safe. So much information that will help people do this activity better. So much information to help people interpret the science better. And so that's why I wrote this book. And the fact that I disclose my own drug use, that's a minor sort of incident in the book.
It's like leadership, essentially, right? It's like you can't have this conversation unless you're willing to put your head above the parapet as well.
Absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned leadership, and I'm certainly trying to be a better person, better leader. And I certainly had to face my children, my family, in that I have to live up to the ideals that I espouse. And this is one case of that.
I just wanted to really delve into that for a minute, and obviously, like we'll go into the broader topic as well. But I would love to know how you approach the conversation with your kids and your wife to say, "I'm going to publicly declare my own personal drug use," and obviously, I don't know what the consequences will be. Right. And of course, like going on something like Joe Rogan, then it's like, and this perspective will be heard by millions of people. Like, how do those conversations, make you feel going into them, and how do you approach them?
Well, if you have children, you'll understand. Well, imagine saying to your children, "Hey guys, I'm going to tell the world that I have sex." That's some stupid shit. I mean, we don't have that kind of conversation. There's no need to do that. Your children know that you're a person of integrity. And if they know that you're doing something, you're doing it for a reason, and they understand the reason. So that wasn't that conversation. It doesn't work like that. We're not like much of the public, in that much of the public hold a lot of incorrect views about drugs. And so maybe they would do that kind of thing, but this is just like any other activity. So it wasn't that kind of conversation.
I love it, and I had my phone on my microphone on mute, but you actually made me laugh. And this is the thing that you do so well, is you explain, often in the book, you put in these parallels. I think one of the things that I really enjoy you translating is you don't say cars are irresponsible. You see a car crash and say that car was irresponsible. You have a driver, and the driver is irresponsible. They get into that car, they drive irresponsibly, and they might crash and they might injure someone else. And that's an irresponsible driver, not an irresponsible car. And I think that kind of language and explaining things in what is essentially layman's terms, but certainly just ways that people are able to understand and relate to their own everyday experience when talking about drug use, is a really great framework, because obviously culture and the media have obviously vilified all drugs, but especially the ones that you particularly find interesting and use as the subject of your latest book, right?
Yeah, I tried to take away the social stigma, the emotional, and the baggage that society has brought to our discussion of drugs. Just sticking with the car accident example. There are cases where people have accidents where the driver may have been irresponsible, or someone distracted the driver, like a passenger. I don't know. Or it could be just poor road conditions. So reason for the car accident could vary widely. But the point is that we typically try to tease apart what is the causal factor, what's caused this accident. We don't automatically blame the car and say we need to ban cars because 40,000 Americans died last year in car accidents. That would be silly.
Okay, so let's get into it then. So for most people, and obviously I guess like people, as far as this conversation was people are obviously complex. There are really two camps, right? Unless I'm mistaken. There's open to taking drugs and therefore will have some experience of it. And then there's, less open to it and therefore might not have tried. And your book isn't really about trying to encourage anyone to try, right? It's actually just discussing the science behind what's going on. And a lot of it is actually around the science of responsibility and freedom.
Yeah, I hope there's more than two camps. I hope there's a wide range of camps out there. Because many of us, we want to keep people safe. So we want to learn as much as we can about an activity, even if we don't care to indulge in that activity. And so I think that's an important aspect to acknowledge. Yeah, in the book, I certainly am not encouraging people to use drugs, try drugs, or anything like that. That's not what I'm doing here. What I'm trying to do is have a grown-up conversation about drugs. In the U.S., at least, a grown-up conversation about drugs just hasn't been had. We are adolescents in many ways in the United States. I mean, when we just think about how old the country is fairly young. I think somebody once said the oldest tradition in the U.S. is high school. And that kind of speaks to our adolescence in terms of a number of things, but especially when it comes to drugs. We can't have a conversation about drugs without someone losing their mind saying something about, I lost this person to drugs. And, you know, I get it because I too have lost people who were said to have died from something like drug-related overdose. And that kind of has inspired me to do this work because I really wanted to know what was going on. And when I dig deeper and deeper, I learned that there were a number of other complex factors that were happening. And I tried to describe many of these complex factors in the new book, and I try and help people to minimize the potentiality of these sort of factors, so we keep people safe.
Okay, so just getting into, like, I guess the actual specifics then. So the drugs that, and I think there's an interesting conversation that we've had before, which is that there's a lot of media attention and awareness towards psychedelics. And that is obviously because there's like a history of sort of trying and failing in society with its impact on mental health and like using it in therapist settings. And now there's very much like a renaissance towards it. I think the interesting thing is when people think about changing their minds towards drugs, they think first and foremost about psychedelics, and actually cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, like the super hardcore ones, so to speak, the way that people perceive hardcore or A class drugs, class A rather, they don't factor into that at all, right? They stay in a very separate bucket in our consciousness and our psyche around, like, you know, dangerous and terrifying or fearful. You know, this language that comes up and is quite different, when obviously the practical side of it is, you know, you might have a safer landing on those than indulging in psychedelics. So I think this is one of the interesting nuances that you bring up, right? Which is that there's a lot of attention to the renaissance of psychedelics, whilst meanwhile no one is actually focusing on not just the story of the other drugs, but also the data behind it.
Yeah, in the book, I take a chapter, the psychedelic chapter, to explain that this distinction that we make between psychedelics and other drugs is largely a false distinction, and it's largely a distinction that it has been used by typically middle class, articulate drug users to separate themselves and their drug use from that of other people who may not be a middle class, and other people who the society has looked down upon. The other people who may use drugs like heroin or crack cocaine or something, or some other drug that's been vilified. But the bottom line is, no matter who you are, if you're taking psychoactive substances, you're putting chemicals in your body to alter your consciousness. Even if you say, oh yeah, I'm taking ayahuasca to enhance my spiritual journey. I'm taking ayahuasca or psilocybin to be at one with the universe. You can put whatever flowery language you want on this activity. That's cool. More power to you. But someone using heroin too can find God. And even though they may not use that same verbal behavior, you all are seeking the same thing. You're doing the same thing. And so one of the things that I implore the reader to do is to consider the fact that they're doing exactly what the heroin user is doing exactly what the crack cocaine user is doing, and that we are all in this together. And so these sort of artificial distinctions, these false distinctions, are not only not helpful, but they are hurtful, because they just facilitate exclusion once again.
And also, when you talk about putting chemicals in your body to elicit some kind of reaction, obviously that just makes me think about alcohol as well, right? Same thing.
It's absolutely the same thing. Alcohol is one of the sort of ideal psychoactive substances because of its chemical physical properties. It's a very small molecule, so it gets into the brain really quickly, and it effectively alters our behavior. That's one of the reasons that alcohol is such our socially acceptable drug, because of in large part because of its chemical properties. But it's certainly a drug. People who are altering their consciousness with alcohol, exactly, you're doing the same thing.
And I think the conversation that we've had in the past about this is, alcohol, again, comes back down to grown-ups, right? In theory, at 18 in the UK, 21 in America, you're considered a grown-up and you're put on this path of responsibility for yourself, and therefore you can drink alcohol. And the idea is that hopefully you behave responsibly with that right, with that opportunity. Whereas across the world, there is no point at which we say, okay, well, the same is true. You're now responsible to try whatever you wish to try to alter your state. What happens, certainly in the UK anyway, is obviously people go out of control between 18 and 21, particularly with their first taste of alcohol, and usually quite a long time before it anyway, before 18 for sure. And it's the same logic, right? It's the same exact thing, which is that you sort of learn the responsibility, hopefully, by trial and error. The difference is you don't have a stigma attached to you for the experience of trying and failing and sort of finding essentially the right dosage and the right circumstance. And indeed, for many people who give up alcohol, right, deciding that it's not for them after all, but they tried it. So I think this is like the other thing, right, which is that that opportunity to try and figure out these things for ourselves when it comes to harder drugs, so to speak, is removed from us entirely. And it's that lack of freedom that actually creates the intense side effect. Sorry, the side effect being extremity, right? So addiction and poor use of it.
Yeah, the alcohol example is good for a number of reasons. One of the more important reasons that the alcohol example is good is because the state, the government usually controls it has power over the quality of alcohol. So there is a level of quality control that the consumer gets. We can be assured that there are no adulterants in our alcohol. There are no contaminants in our alcohol. If we think back in the United States when we had alcohol prohibition from 1920 to 1933, people didn't stop drinking, but the alcohol was being produced illicitly. And what that meant was that now the alcohol contained many contaminants. Tens of thousands of Americans were killed or maimed from these contaminants. But once alcohol prohibition was repealed, these deaths and these injuries, they went away because the state ensured that there was a certain level of quality control for alcohol. Now, fast forward to today, we think about many of the drugs that people are using that are not legally regulated, like MDMA, cocaine, heroin, a wide range of these drugs that are not legally regulated. There's no quality control, and many people get injured and hurt because they don't know that their substance that they bought illicitly contains a contaminant, and the contaminants oftentimes are worse than the substance that people are actually seeking. Another issue is that people don't know the dose, and sometimes they overdo it. And when you overdo it, of course, you can that could lead to some problems, and so in some cases, it can be fatal. And so, it's important that we emphasize the fact that we need quality control in order to keep our citizens safely. And I try to argue this in Drug Use for Grown-Ups.
So before we go to questions, because I do want to say, like, if you have a question, I'd love you to put your hand up now, because I'm checking the queue and we're going to start accepting questions, because I think the main value here is to enable people to come up and actually speak to Carl about this, whatever their experience might be. Before we do that, Carl, do you have any data or information about cocaine, about heroin, about MDMA or methamphetamine that you think could just be broadly interesting for people to know in the audience?
Can you be specific, please? What type of data would you like?
Yes, very fair. You're right. That was an unbelievably broad question. So, you know, if the residing narrative is drugs are bad, I think one of the things that we find quite interesting, like when we were speaking, is, you know, there's less data to say that cocaine specifically is bad for you. Like that, it's more like how you respond, like how your personal actions and your personal responsibility to how you're choosing to take it, the volume you're choosing, etc., and then the behaviors that you take whilst you're on it. Those seem to be more what defines what bad is, so to speak, right? As in, I think the thing that I'd like to discuss is, you know, the definition of what a bad drug is. How do we really define that? Is cocaine bad, or is the user bad?
Okay, thank you. So it's important that everybody understands that drugs are not bad or good. They're just inert substances waiting for a biological system to interact with. And that's how they produce the effects. And those effects are dependent upon a wide range of things: the environment under which the drug is taken. For example, if you take a drug like cocaine in a comfortable environment in your home, a protected space, negative effects are a lot less likely than if you take a drug, let's say next to a police shop, and they're peeping into your house and you are paranoid or worried about them coming into your place. That's not going to be a good experience. And so context is critically important. But here's the bottom line. As a researcher who's been studying drugs in people for nearly 25 years, and who has given thousands of doses of these drugs that we're talking about to people